criminalising men who use prostitutes. In the rest of the UK, it's not illegal, although things like soliciting for sex in a public place is outlawed. There are now calls for the rest of the UK to follow Northern Ireland's lead. Others argue that the best protection for sex workers is actually legalisation. Our reporter Catherine Nye has been looking at how the system works in the UK at the moment, meeting current and former prostitutes, police officers and men who pay for sex. She also travels to Sweden with campaigners who want their model adopted elsewhere.
You're getting wet. Are you going to be out here all night?
Saturday night in Nottingham.
How many years have you been doing this?
16, on and off.
And with the city's prostitution task force, led by Sergeant Neil Radford, he has strong opinions about how the law in the UK needs to change.
This is probably our most popular corner these days. Right opposite the park.
So the current debate is because Sweden, Norway, Northern Ireland soon have all made buying sex illegal. Is that right?
For me, the debate is really about how do we protect women who are currently involved in prostitution and how do we assist them to exit that kind of lifestyle. And for me, the best way to do that is to not criminalise the women who are being forced to provide the sexual services, but to clamp down on the men who are providing the demand for it.
Surely by criminalising prostitution further, you are just massively increasing the stigma around an already massively stigmatised industry.
It always strikes me that if people think that we should be legalising prostitution, that it's acceptable. Well, if it's acceptable, why don't they go home and tell their wives and girlfriends that that's what they're doing?
Neil patrols the streets most nights. He's got to know the prostitutes well.
So how many years have you been doing this now? And I've known you 10 years.
Since you were 19 and you're now 53. As it stands, the law around this kind of prostitution is complex. Around 1 in 10 British men are paid for sex and are legally allowed to do that. The only thing that is illegal is soliciting or loitering in a public place. And that basically means the prostitute and the client doing a deal in public to have sex.
How you doing?
My drug use and that is not helping.
Yeah.
Yeah, being honest, yeah?
You know, there's talk about potentially changing the legislation and making purchasing sex absolute and sort of clamping down on the punters.
Yeah.
What would you like to see the government do to make your life better?
Right now, right this second, legalise prostitution.
Why?
It just make it safe for the girls, do you get me? Safe for the alright clients as well, do you know what I mean? Because they're not all bad. They have to go for check-ups, do you know what I mean? Even taxes.
You'd like to pay tax?
Yeah, if it meant
have it regulated.
If it meant that I was safe and it meant that I could do what I was doing and be safer, yeah.
If you didn't have to do this, would you?
No, obviously not, no.
So you'd like to get out if you could?
Yeah, of course.
See, what would you like to be able to have?
Just the chances that everyone else gets, isn't it? It's not to be judged, basically. We didn't wake up one day and decide we were going to be a prostitute, you know what I mean? We've all got a story to tell.
Street prostitution is one issue here. Neil says there are around 50 women working in Nottingham. Go online though, and almost 2,000 appear to be advertising. We pull up at a known brothel.
We've been here 2 or 3 times before. It's 4 Romanian women. It's not always the same women, but they're always from Romania that are in here. Hello. Oh my God. I found you.
Hello.
Oh my God.
So our first priority is to make sure everyone here is everybody's safe and everybody's well. If anybody's making you come and do this, or if anybody's forced you to come into this country.
So this house counts as a brothel because there's more than 2 women in it selling sex. And that means that while they're not breaking the law, anyone involved in running this house, so renting it out basically, is committing a crime. The youngest girl here is 18. Only one speaks English. She's been doing this for 2 years and sends money home to Romania. Her parents think she's waitressing. Do any of the girls here want to work in prostitution?
Nobody pushes us.
Would you prefer to do something else?
To be the same money with the same money? We do just for the money. We don't do for pleasure.
Is it okay?
No.
No.
They believe if they pay you for 1 hour, 2 hours, you They buy with all. They buy your body, your soul, your everything. They own you. With the body, it's easy, you understand? But inside, I know too many ladies which they have big problems, psychological.
Psychologically.
Yeah.
Overall, she would prefer legalisation, but says criminalising the buyer would reduce demand.
If you don't have clients, of course, how you don't do this job, yeah.
So you think
Never.
that would reduce it but not stop it?
Yeah. Oh, stop it, never, never.
All of the girls tonight have said they prefer legalisation. How can you argue against that?
The problem is that while prostitution is here and while they're engaging in it, they're trapped in it. Most of them have done this since they were in their mid-teens and they really don't know any other form of life.
That's not true with the girl we just met. She's only done it for 2 years. She's a waitress as well. She does know another life. She doesn't have a drug problem, which I know is not necessarily typical.
But also what you've seen there are 3 young women aged from about 18 to early 20s who've been taken from their families in Eastern Europe, are brought to a country where they don't speak the language, don't know the culture. They are also just as much trapped in this.
Neil is determined that we need to cut out the buyer. Ben is that buyer.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Ben. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
He's a 30-year-old single man who works in PR in London. He's paid for sex since he was 22, and Ben is not his real name.
So how often do you do this?
Usually I'll go and meet an escort about once every 2 to 4 weeks. In London it's usually about £100 an hour.
So why is it that you pay for sex?
For a lot of the time I struggle with women, and paying for sex for me is a way of experiencing the kind of sex that I probably wouldn't without paying for it, frankly.
Ben sleeps with prostitutes or escorts he finds online. He meets them at their homes or hotels.
So how many prostitutes have you slept with?
Between 30 and 40, although I haven't kept an exact count. They tend to be single mothers or students, mostly because hours that sex work offers are quite flexible.
If buying sex was made illegal, would it stop you?
It would stop me from buying sex in this country. To me, it's not worth the risk of being arrested for a crime that would have such a stigma attached to it. An anti-prostitution advocate would probably see that as a good thing. They would see it as working. What they don't take into account is that the fewer clients there are, the less choice there is for people who work in the sex industry. It would give them less choice in the type of customer they had, which would probably mean that they would have to take greater risks. The thing people don't understand when they talk about the morality of paying for sex is there's a huge variation inside the sex industry. Does the fact that, for example, someone who may be working in porn might have a drugs habit that compels them to keep working in porn, meaning that someone who watches that person's film is guilty? To me, it's a grey area. For a lot of customers, it's not so much the orgasm that they're chasing, it's the intimacy of just being able to lie with someone in a bed for 1 or 2 hours that's absent from their regular life. If I had never paid for sex, I would have had a very lonely life.
So in some countries, what Ben is doing is already illegal. I've come to Sweden. Here, buying sex is a criminal offence, but the selling is completely legal. Last year, an all-party parliamentary group on prostitution recommended that the UK introduce the same law. Sergeant Neil Radford and other campaigners who want the UK to do this have come here to produce a report on how it could work back home.
In Sweden, it's prohibited to buy sexual services everywhere, anywhere. Either it's a private home or either it's a public place.
Mia de Frietje is one of the campaigners. She worked as a prostitute in Ireland for 6 years.
What were your experiences while you were working in prostitution?
We begin to see the world a very different way, because within a short period of time your only human contact becomes men who buy you, and then the other damaged or addicted women that you stand alongside. So we don't quite see the world the same way as everybody else.
Is it acceptable to say to someone who works in prostitution, who may enjoy working in prostitution, no, you can't do this, this is not your right?
The one thing that this law is not about is the minority, the handful of women that say they are happy to be there. This law is not about them. This law is about the vast majority of women who feel, like me, trapped. This law is to stop the traffic, because it will not stop on you till we cut off what makes it exist in the first place, and that is the demand. That is those who believe they have a right to buy other human beings for sex. The collateral damage for those who say they are happy to be there is that they will have to look for a new job. That's collateral damage I can sleep with.
Some people working in prostitution argue that this is a right, this is an absolute right for people to sell their bodies. Why is it so divisive?
Yeah, I don't believe doing what you want with your own body is an absolute right. I don't believe it's an absolute right. Not if in doing what you do with your body, if in doing so feeds into an industry which at its worst leads to the rape and sodomization of young women and girls, then no, it's a much more limited right.
The group meets Patrik Siadalov, Sweden's national coordinator against prostitution and trafficking.
When you talk about prostitution, even in the countries where you have the legal frame of prostitution, I mean, where are the positive things?
There are still women on the street, so you haven't been able to eradicate street prostitution completely?
I don't think that's possible. I mean, like with all forms of legislations, if you don't have the problem, you don't need the legislation. We have a clear decrease.
What sort of a difference has the legislation made to the number of women on the street?
I think before or around when we had the legislation, it was around 700-800 persons identified in the street prostitution arena every year. Now we have the number we're talking about 200 persons per year.
Opponents to the Swedish model have strong grounds to be sceptical. They say it drives prostitution into more risky locations, and that criminalising makes it more difficult to protect the health of those selling. I catch up with Neil and Mia after their final meeting in Sweden.
What have you seen here that you want back in the UK?
The big frustration for me is that purchasing sex off street is not an offence unless there's exploitation or coercion of the woman involved, so that the sex buyer off street situations walks away scot-free every time. That is a key thing for me, and in Sweden that doesn't happen.
The date, the 10th of October 2010, is the last night I was bought, and I turned it into something positive because it's the last night. And since then, what has changed in my life predominantly is that I'm not for sale. And being in Sweden, I've just realised it's actually only one of 3 countries where I don't need that tattoo. In every other country in the world, I am for sale. I've just realised I don't need this tattoo in this country, and that's powerful to me.
And that report by Catherine Nye, you can watch it again on our programme page, bbc.co.uk/Victoria. Let's talk now to Niki Adams, a former sex worker from the English Collective of Prostitutes, and Kat Banyard from the End Demand Alliance. Welcome, both of you. From next month then, Northern Ireland makes it illegal to pay for sex, makes it illegal to buy sex with the sex buyer law. Should that be rolled out across the rest of the UK, Niki?
Absolutely not. I mean, when they were discussing the law, most sex workers, over 90% of sex workers said they didn't want this law, and over 80% said that it would make it more dangerous.
Why?
And all the evidence shows that criminalisation of clients doesn't stop prostitution. It doesn't even stop the criminalisation of sex workers, of women. But what it does do is make it much more dangerous and stigmatising to work. It means that all the safety procedures that we as sex workers employ are undermined by the fact that the police are after clients. The clients are therefore fearful of arrest. On the street, it means that you're pushed into more isolated areas, and in premises it means that clients, you cannot find out who your clients are, and therefore you're much more vulnerable to attack. Because, you know, clients, you know, where there is a question of violence and rape and other violence, often people target sex workers because they know that it's much more difficult for us to report violence, that if we do come forward, we're less likely to be believed, and this kind of law will just make that situation much worse.
Kat Banyard, do you think it's naive to think that if you remove the demand, so if you criminalise the men paying for sex, then women will stop selling their bodies?
Well, of course, the only reason that the prostitution trade and the global sex trafficking trade exist is because there is demand, because there are, in this country, a minority of men who are willing and wanting to pay for sex. If the demand didn't exist, there would be no supply of vulnerable women and girls into the global prostitution trade.
Now we have exist because women need money to survive.
We have a huge problem of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking into this country. Sex trafficking is worth £130 million to the traffickers every single year. Now we need to be doing every single thing that we can to make it as difficult as possible for pimps and sex traffickers to operate here in the UK.
Well, then tell our audience what sort of women, in your experience and who are part of your collective, are selling sex.
I mean, it's women from, you know, their 20s right through to their 50s who are mostly mothers, often single mothers, who are struggling to survive, struggling to pay their mortgage, struggling to cover their rent, struggling to put food on the table.
Are they being exploited by others?
We're now seeing, no, in fact, most sex workers in this country are not trafficked. I mean, it's a tiny proportion of sex workers that are trafficked, and it's a similar proportion to trafficking in other industries. And most sex workers are actually just working together with friends in premises. They may be renting premises, or they may have a employer, but it's a very similar situation to other self-employed people, all working on the street. And in fact, we're now seeing a big increase in sex workers on the street as a result of things like benefit sanctions. And if people are really serious about getting women out of prostitution, then you have to tackle the reality of women's lives. Benefit sanctions have massively increased the amount of women in prostitution. The austerity, the cuts, the rise in homelessness, 29% of children in this country are living in poverty. That means that their mothers are worrying every single day how they're going to manage from day to day and make sure that their children are fed.
Do you accept that,
and under those circumstances, why, if you want to crack down on prostitution, tackle that reality. Don't bring in something that's actually going to make it more dangerous and stigmatising for sex workers to work.
Sexual exploitation is not a solution to poverty, and that is why trade unions like Unison, the Scottish Trade Union Congress, are part of the End Demand Alliance. So they are at the forefront of campaigning for economic justice, but they also recognise that sexual exploitation is not an answer. And what we need to do is to support women, the vast majority of whom say that they would like to get out, as we saw in the film.
The vast majority of office workers would like to get out of their job.
What the sex buyer law does is support women to exit the sex trade. So it decriminalises selling sex, and that's crucial. We've got to shift that burden of criminality, get it off of the women
it's not illegal
sex.
To sell sex in the UK. It's illegal to solicit or loiter.
That's right. And we find that the burden of criminality invariably falls on the women who are selling. We've got to stop that, and we've got to shift that burden of criminality and put it on to those who are fueling this trade, who are the reason that it exists, and that is the sex buyers.
Okay, that Stockholm example did show that over quite a period of time, the number of street prostitutes has gone down from something like 700 to 800 to 200 since they brought in the sex buyer legislation.
I know, but your film, unfortunately, didn't speak to sex workers in Sweden. For example, Rose Alliance, which is a very active sex worker organisation. And if it had, they would have found out that what sex workers are saying is that you're still criminalised if you work together with a friend from premises. You face eviction by landlords. You face harassment by the police. A lot of sex workers have been moved out to border towns, and that sex workers generally are less visible and less safe as a result of this law. So that is what we are very fearful of here. We feel that if there is an alternative, there is the possibility of decriminalisation brought in New Zealand in 2003 with verifiable improvements in sex workers' health and safety, and more able to come forward and report the rape and violence. We do want to target the rape and violence, but you have to make a distinction between prostitution and trafficking and prostitution and rape. And what are men doing that people find such a problem? I mean, fundamentally it's sex. People have sex under all kinds of circumstances, and on this occasion it's being exchanged for money, and it shouldn't be a criminal offence.
OK, well, just deal with that. We accept there's exploitation, of course we do. We accept that some women are extremely vulnerable and are taken advantage of. There are women, and Niki was one of them, who believe that sex between a man and a woman, consenting adult sex between a man and a woman where money changes hands is absolutely fine. What is wrong with that in your point of view?
Well, let's be clear about what we're talking about. The Crown Prosecution Service
just giving you an example
recognises
of
prostitution as a form of violence against
But
women.
we don't.
It's a form of sexual exploitation.
As sex workers, we don't. We say that this is a decision that we've made, often a decision from a very bad set of choices, and we are organising for our own safety and for our own rights, and we feel like we deserve support from feminists like yourself to actually improve our situation, to actually get health and safety, to get trade union recognition, to be able to, the right to refuse clients.
Well,
to
sex
deal
trade
with the
survivors
violence
are involved in calling for reform in the law. Now, we've got to tackle what underpins this, which is the demand. The majority of men in this country do not pay for sex, and in fact many would be appalled to think that someone could think it's okay for them to pay vulnerable women and girls to perform sex acts on them. The vast majority of men don't. What we need to do is hold accountable the minority of men who do, and who are the lifeblood of the global sex trafficking trade.
Thank you both for talking to us on the programme this morning. Many comments, particularly on our Facebook page and right across social media. In fact, Andrew Turner on Facebook says, yep, that's right, our generation is miraculously going to be the first generation in history to stop prostitution. As long as there is someone who's comfortable paying for it, there will be someone comfortable to take the money. May as well legitimise it and give working girls more protection rather than driving them underground. Anita Watts on Facebook says, make it legal, but in a safe house, so the women are off the streets. Emily on Twitter says, legalise and regulate, encourage well-run brothels and a register of prostitutes for human trafficking prevention. Joe McKee on Facebook says, so the oldest of trades is to be wiped out. Fair enough, but why should men get criminalised for paying, but women don't for offering the trade? And one more for now. Megan Key on Facebook, supply and demand. Consenting adults should be free to make these choices, or is it not a free world? Thank you both. And if you want to get in touch, you're very welcome. It's victoria@bbc.co.uk, or you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and so on and so forth. Still to come on the programme, the latest on a long-running legal battle between Skype and Sky. Do you get confused between those two names? More on that a little bit later. Coming up to 10 o'clock, which means it's time for the latest weather. Hello, Carol.